I was about 8 years ago, Danny Silk came into my office, and I had the door open, and he stood in the doorway, and he said, hey, come talk to me in my office. And I said, okay. He said, hurry, because I have 15 minutes before I have to run to the plane. I said, okay. So I walked in his office, and he looked really serious. And I'm like, usually we're kind of bantering back and forth. We've known each other since we were kids. So I go, what's going on? He said, well, listen, this is going to be a little rough because I only have 15 minutes. And Danny's usually, I teasingly say, Danny can cut you with a sword, and it's so sharp, you don't know you've been cut till you go home and bleed to death. I can say the same thing. They're like, oh, he ran over me with a tractor. And Daniel will say the same thing. The person's like, oh, Danny, he was, and I said, what did you say to you? I'm like, that's what I said to you. So he's very diplomatic, very wise and diplomatic. And so he said, you know, and he didn't say the word diplomatic. He said, I don't have time to actually go through all the steps with you, so I just want to tell you what I'm thinking. And I feel like I need to say it before I'm gone on this 2-week trip. I said, okay. He said, you're arrogant. And your arrogance is like leaking out on people. I think that was his opening statement. You know, you do work for me, right? What are you doing for a job next week? And I was like, okay. And then so I said, okay. And that's not Danny's normal mode, by the way. That usually comes like 15 minutes, and then you figure out like he just told you were arrogant when you got home. You're like, did he just say I was arrogant? And I said, well, you know, obviously, why do you think that? Like, what happened for you to say that? And he named 3 different people that I had a conversation with, in which I was just like, he said, you know, when you talk to so-and-so, and 2 of them were speakers, and 1 of them was a staff person. And he said, I was involved. I was there when you said this and this and that. And I immediately defended myself. I'm like, no, that's not what I was thinking. Like, you did what Bill just said. You misjudged my using your gift of discernment, and it's actually suspicion. I didn't actually say that. I did defend myself, though. I said, no, that's not what I was, no, that wasn't in my heart, And so, you know, you know, it took him about 10 minutes to tell me what, you know, those 3 stories, and you know what he felt and what the Lord showed him, And it took me about 5 minutes to defend myself. And he stood up and he said, "Listen, I told you, you just work it out. I'm going." I'm like, okay, we're gonna, you know, you ever have this conversation, just crash the plane into the ground and walk out and like no closure? I'm like, okay, I'll text you. Well, that's always fun. You know, you get to guess the tone when someone's texting you, right? And you always read the tone in it, the one you're in. I'm going to say this to him, so he must be saying that to me, right? That always works. Never try to solve a conflict through email, text. I need to put it on the mirror because I do it all the time. It just gets worse. So he leaves, and I go, and I know Danny has a big place in my life. I mean, he's one of my wise counselors. I'm like, all right. And I'm driving home about an hour later, and I'm driving home, and I really am hurting. I'm really hurting, and I'm like, wow, my friend thinks I'm arrogant. And I'm actually defending myself. I'm like, well, you know, he just needs to, like, get a life. You know, he doesn't understand, like, confidence always looks like arrogance to the insecure, you know? I got all these one-liners going through my mind, you know? You can spiritualize your dysfunction and it gets to stay. I mean, Bill said something like that today. So, you know, I go home and I'm working in my shop, but I'm not really thinking about anything except for what he said to me. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's terrible. And I'm actually not thinking that he's right. I'm actually thinking about how to convince him he's wrong. And you ever argue both sides in your mind? I'm arguing both sides. He's going to say this, and I'm going to say this when we sit down next time. I got a good point I didn't think of when I was in there because he got up too soon. So that night I went to bed, and I wasn't doing a lot of sleeping. I laid awake. And then I decided to pray, like 3 o'clock in the morning. It came to that, finally, you know. You ever do that? Like, I don't know why you just don't start there. And I said, Lord, you know, Danny has this issue with me. I hate this, man. I hate having friends. And the Lord said to me, if you don't trust someone more than you trust yourself, then you can't get out of deception, because the nature of deception is you don't know you're deceived, which is what I had taught the month before. Like, that's a good word, Lord. Where'd you get that? From my message? Got some intellectual property rights on that going on, I want you to know. The Lord repeated my words. And he said, you said that. So what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. And so the Lord said, do you trust Danny more than you trust yourself? I'm like, well, not at this point. And then I just spent the next half hour just recounting the amount of times that he's helped me in my life, spoke into my life. And, and he just reminded me, he loves you. You know that he would have not done that to hurt you. I'm like, okay, that's true. Doesn't feel true right now, but I'm sure it's true. And so about, I don't know, and maybe an hour went by and kind of wrestling with that. And then I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to believe he's right, because I have to trust someone more than I trust me. This is exactly how it happened. Within 20 seconds of me saying that to the Lord, I instantly saw my motive, which was total arrogance. You know when that happens, you're just like, oh my God. And then I started seeing a whole bunch more where Danny didn't know about. How many have ever had that happen and you're like, I'm a worm, I'm a worm, I'm a worm. I am such a worm. Oh God, forgive me. So the next week we were in staff meeting and I apologized to the entire staff, told them what happened and asked them to forgive me. And I wrote a letter to both those guys that I had spoken to. They were traveling speakers that were friends of ours. And I said, man, this came up in my heart. And there was actually 2 or 3 more messes I went back and cleaned up. But how many know you'll need someone in your life that in tough times you trust them more than you trust yourself? Because we all get into these, it's not just about you. Sometimes you get in these things with your family, you're so emotionally connected, right? You know what you would tell someone else, but you don't know what to tell you. And you need your faithful counsel, your proactive counsel to come around you and speak truth in your life. And sometimes what they're sharing with you doesn't feel true, but you're like, I've trusted this person for 30 years. I will certainly trust this counsel. It doesn't feel true, but I bet it's true. That's a good word.